What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video, and today's video is going to be about breaking a low block and creating goal scoring chances against a team that's going to be sitting deeper. And before we start, please like and subscribe to the channel. You guys have been great about that. It's been a huge help, so thank you so much for that. But without wasting any more time, let's get right into the video. And the first thing I want to point out is the defensive team. A lot of times teams will play with a 4-5-1 or a 5-4-1, and even recently the team that comes to mind when talking about like different formations and new ideas is it was the West Brom game against Liverpool. They actually moved to almost like a six in the back at times, where their back four really got narrow, and then their wide midfielders then dropped in to cover the full width of the field in kind of a different fashion than I've seen before, or at least I've seen very often. So the thing we're going to want to talk about today is this is going to be just a one video, and we're just going to try and look into detail one concept of how to break down a low block, a few concepts involving pinning and exploiting key spaces. So I know that people putting together game models and stuff, there's really two processes to do that, at least from the offensive organization standpoint. And a really interesting idea that I've read about is coaches will actually start with their ideal goal and how they want it to finish, and then work back through the thirds of the field or through their phases of possession on how to get there. So they know where they want to end up, and then they work back on how they get there. Whereas other teams, they look at their first progression and move up the field from there. So both very interesting ideas, and both work well, just a personal preference and maybe just your philosophy and what you believe in as a coach. But let's get back into it. So I highlighted the assist zones, and these are the spaces we're going to look to exploit, because these are the areas where assists are at the highest likelihood, and they're just very dangerous areas. And then the goal from here is to then obviously exploit the space in front of the goal. So I can also highlight that in yellow. So then the goal would then to be exploit this area to create a high likelihood of scoring a goal. So our first example is always our rest defense is super important. So how we do that can vary, but we've talked about that before, and with the 2-3 rest defense shape, I think that would be good for this scenario. But now we gotta look at the defense's low block, and are they playing with 4 or 5 in the back line, and what are their tendencies? Are they space oriented, or do they track runners? So pretty much the big idea is, for this situation, is unbalancing the team, and we can do this using wide structures, wide rotations. I'm going to highlight here 3 players involved on one side and 3 players involved on another. So from here we have the 3 players in the wide structures pointed out on each side, and then this is a great way to use rotations and unbalance the defense. So first off, if you have a defender who's more than competent on the ball, it can be useful to allow him to drive forward and then pull out a midfielder. So now a midfielder is effectively pressing the defender, and now what happens is the midfield shifts, but now a player from the midfield line is actively engaged with a player from your defensive line, which will unbalance the team. So now there should be free players further forward, and keep in mind that The players on your team should be positioned between opponents, especially against a space-oriented, but also against a man-oriented system, because this will put them into lose-lose situations. So from here, when a midfielder is drawn out, just naturally, the space between the lines is increased, which is super important when attacking the low block, that you undo a team's compactness even just a little bit, because in the low block, teams are the most compact out of any of the 3 blocks or anywhere else on the field. So I've just highlighted the compactness, and with the midfielder jumping, then now becomes the how do we access this space? How do we want to access this space? So it could be a third man action to get a player on the ball in this space, and then from here, the players between the lines, it can elicit a few different reactions, usually a narrowing and the ball goes wide. But then we look to see where the player ends up, and he ends up in the wide corridor, which isn't exactly what we wanted in an ideal scenario. So we should try to have concepts that lead to our ideal goal scoring opportunity, so everything is cohesive and everyone's on the same page. Obviously, that situation wouldn't be the worst case scenario, but we just want to keep it to what our goal is. So here, a lot of times teams will attack through the width. So if we're using a wide rotation, maybe we can have an inverted fullback, so we narrow the defense, because usually the wide midfielders are responsible for the wide fullbacks, so they can be easily manipulated to be narrow, and with our 8 between the lines, between defenders, that will naturally narrow a back 4, and this will free up the player in the wide area, so he may even be able to be played directly, and then here he can advance the ball just a little bit, and now this will force the fullback to jump out to him, and then now that's when the goal assist zone, I should say, will be available. So exploiting the wide area, I know the wide area isn't always seen as the most dangerous, but it can be a really good avenue to unbalance the defense and stretch them horizontally. So we just looked at 2 scenarios with a center back driving forward to pull out a midfielder to stretch them vertically, but now using the wide area and an inverted fullback to stretch them horizontally. And so a lot of key trends here will be having systems in your offensive organization phase to then do counter actions to kind of manipulate the defense in multiple ways. So it's likely that they'll give out or give out to one of the ways that your team's moving or the concepts that you're facing. So now another common low block is a 5-4-1, and this one's a bit different because of these 3 central defenders and just the concepts that come with a 3 center back system versus a 2 center back system. So now we can look at the advantages of potentially what we have to do to, again, get into the assist zone. So I'll keep them highlighted just for the sake of the visual, so we know where we want to end up. And so now we have our 2 attacking midfielders and our center striker, and now the key here for them will be to try and pin or manipulate the wide center backs, because they'll be the most easily manipulated because they do have the cover of the most central defender, and he he won't jump as much because of the space he'll concede if he does so. So with that in mind, we know the wide center backs will be more aggressive to jump and move out of this space. So when one jumps, the space will then be created in behind and less cover. So then a dynamic superiority or dynamic run into this area can then be in place. So how do we get there though? So that's the idea, but we want to look on how we get there. And it can be overloading one side. So if we have our striker, maybe our striker can pin the wide center back. And with a back three, they often pass players on much more, or back five, because there are more players to cover. So with one player pinned, we have our inverted fullback, our holding midfielder, and our other fullback. So now, when we drive forward, and the four midfielders now will have to be tighter. So now, and obviously with the high compactness, there may be more circulations and angles may be cut down more often, just because of the less space the defense has to cover. So the ability for them to become compactness and have high spatial control will increase very much. But with this being said, we now have players in both situations. So now effectively the wing back is essentially pinned by the wide midfielder, and now the central midfielder can be drawn towards the inverted fullback, or he can be drawn out by the advancing center back. So with all this happening, there could be openings. Maybe the wide midfielder jumps to try and force him back into circulation, but then we can also have a movement to then create positional superiority between the lines, and then with the winger coming inside, we can then create dynamic superiority in the box. And then once we get here, then we have two runners against the wide center backs, and so now one runner can make his run across to the near post to push the back line back. So when this happens, when the runner makes his run to the near post, he'll want to go across the face of the defenders so they see him, which will then drive them forward and deeper and open up the top of the box for the cutback on the ground for an easy inside the foot finish. Alright, well, so that's just a quick introductory video on a few concepts and ideas to get you thinking about how to break down a low block. So with that, that'll wrap up today's video, and just want to say thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.